So the next thing we're going to do is discuss the geometries that the molecules will make. So the Lewis, remember that a Lewis dot structure is only two-dimensional, and so it doesn't really show what the molecule actually looks like. There's actually two theories for chemical bonding, the valence bond theory and the molecular orbital theory. We're going to focus mainly on the valence bond theory. If you're interested in molecular orbital, that's actually in the balance of chapter 10, which we're not going to get to this semester. So by molecular geometry, it's the general shape of the molecule, and it's determined by the way that the atoms are arranged around each other. Okay, so the valence shell electron pair repulsion model, or sometimes called the VSEPR model, predicts the shapes of the molecules and ions by assuming that the valence shell electrons are arranged as far apart from one another as possible. So again, electrons don't like to be close to each other. They want to be as far, they don't want to be in each other's way. They want to be far apart. And so this is what leads to the VSEPR theory. So what we need to do is look at the center atom, and we need to note the arrangement of the electron pairs around that central atom, or notice how they're going to be organized. Because electron clouds shape like balloons, they kind of spread out and take up a bunch of space. The following slide will show you how they arrange themselves. And if you actually take some balloons and do this, take two balloons and hold them together and see how they lie, or three balloons. So here you can see the different shapes. So of course I don't think these are really balloons. I think these are Easter eggs. But two balloons spread out the way you see in the top left. Three balloons make like a triangular planar. Four balloons, you can see we start to see some three-dimensional. It's not going to be like a cross. It's going to they take up space by spreading out in 3 dimensions. 5 on the bottom left. Notice the two different colors. We'll talk about that in a minute. It has to do with bond angles. And then if you've got 6 regions, so up to 12 electrons, 12 electrons or 6 regions gives you what we call the octahedral. We'll look at those in more detail in just a second. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit further. So what you're going to do is when you have the Lewis dot structure already made, look at the center atom and determine how many electron pairs are around the central atom. So what do you count for an electron pair? Well, a bond is considered an electron pair. Unshared pairs are also considered an electron pair. Now, because of the way double bonds and triple bonds work, even though they're not exactly in the same location, there's some way that they organize themselves, but we're going to count any kind of bond as one region. So even if it's a single, a double, or a triple bond, they all count as one region. But very, very, very important that you count the unshared pairs as a region. Then you can arrange the electron pairs as shown in the next slide. Okay, so if you have 2 pairs, they are going to want to be as far apart from each other as possible, which we call the linear structure. So you can see the 2 pairs. This time they're not, in this case, we're not distinguishing between a bond or an unshared pair, but two regions of electrons as far apart from each other will be linear, and that leads to a 180-degree bond angle from one end to the other. 3 pairs is called trigonal planar because it is like a triangle and it's planar. It's all in one plane. And the bond angles here are 120 degrees. Now 4 pairs gets us more into our 3-dimensional state. So 4 pairs is called tetrahedral. And you can see that actually one of the bonds, 2 of them are in the plane of the board, one is coming out at you and one is going backward. So they try to show the 3-dimensionality there in this structure. The bond angles there are 109.5. 5 pairs give a trigonal bipyramidal, and this one is the unique one because there's actually 2 bond angles. So the 3 form a triangle around the center, very similar to trigonal planar, so a trigonal planar center. And then there's one going up and one coming down. So the bond angle between the center and the top or bottom is 90 degrees, and then the angle between the center atoms is 120 degrees. And then finally, if you have 6 pairs, you have the octahedral, which is a little bit of a misnomer. So actually, if you counted the sides, there's 8 sides to the octagon, octahedral, but there's actually only 6 points or six electron pairs. And the bond angles there are 90 degrees. Okay, so once you figure out your overall shape, if you count, if you've got 2, you're linear, 3, trigonal planar, 4, tetrahedral, 5, trigonal bipyramidal, 6, octahedral. But then we need to drill down a little bit more, and what we're going to do is look at the balance of bonds, actual bonds to unshared pairs. Okay, so count the total, which gives you the overall shape, and then you look at how many are actual bonding and how many are unshared pairs. So we'll see that in the following slides. Okay, so if you have two regions, it's linear, and if they're both bonding, it's still linear. Actually, even if one was bonding and one was an unshared pair, it would still be linear. That would just be 2 atoms bonded together, which can't be anything but linear. So that's pretty straightforward. What if you have 3 regions? Okay, if all 3 regions are bonding, you get the top picture, the trigonal planar. So if there's 3 regions, overall the arrangements of pairs is trigonal planar, and if all 3 are bonding, the geometry is also trigonal planar. And you see an example of BF3 there. Remember, B is one of those exceptions to the rules that only needs 6 electrons. But what if you have 3 regions, 2 are bonding and 1 is an unshared pair? Well, you get this bent molecular geometry. So notice that even though there's only 2 things actually bonded to the center, it's not linear, it's bent, because that third thing that's actually attached to the center, the lone pair, takes up space, just like a balloon would, and would push the other 2 downward. So you get the bent shape. Okay, in the same way, if you have 4 regions, the overall shape is tetrahedral. And if all 4 are bonding, again, we get it's called the tetrahedral molecular geometry, and you can see CH4. This is the way you should draw it, by the way. If you're trying to draw the structures, you want to show the wedges and the dashes. So the wedge means it's coming at you, and the dash means it's going away from you. So you definitely want to show your 3-dimensionality. Either, I think the easiest way is in the example. If you want to sort of show, if you're a really good drawer, you can draw something like the molecular geometry in the center, but really just wedges and dashes can make all the difference. If you have 3 regions that are bonding and 1 that's unshared pair, you get the trigonal pyramidal. Again, even though there's only 3 things actually bonded to the center, the 4th region, the electrons, take up space and push the others down. So that's why you get that pyramidal shape. If you have 2 bonding and 2 lone pairs, the 2 lone pairs take up space, and so you again get a bent shape. This bent shape is actually 109.5 degrees, whereas the bent for 3 would be 120 degrees. So it's even a little bit closer together because the 2 unshared pairs take up space. Okay, 5, you've got a lot of choices here. 5, again, like I said, is kind of a peculiar one. If all 5 are bonding, of course, you have the trigonal bipyramidal, so that's your molecular geometry, and you can see PCl5 is an example of that. And again, now the 3 of the CLs are all in the same plane, but one CL is coming at you with a wedge, and one CL is going backwards with a dash. Now, like I said, 5 is kind of a weird one, and remember that unshared pairs, they actually really like to spread out. They really like to take up space, so they would prefer to be in a place where they have the most room. So because 5 has the 2 different bond angles, the lone pair will only end up around the center because they have more space to spread out, because remember the bond angles around the center are 120 degrees, whereas the up and down are only 90 degrees. So the lone pairs will never show up on the top or bottom. They'll only surround the center. So if you have 1 lone pair, you have what's called the seesaw shape. And if you actually make this, you'll get to, hopefully in lab at some point, you'll get to make these models and make sure and make the seesaw. You can see why it's a seesaw. It kind of looks just like a seesaw. If you have 3 bonding regions and 2 unshared pairs, the 2 unshared pairs again are around the center, and so you have what's called the T-shaped. And if you have 2 bonding and 3 unshared pairs, then you have the bottom one, which is linear again. Just don't forget that there's 3 unshared pairs around the center. Okay, finally, if you have 6 molecular geometry, 6 regions, and all 6 are bonding, you have the octahedral. So overall, 6 is octahedral, and if all 6 are bonding, the molecular geometry is still octahedral. And you can see SF6, so you can see the dashes going back and the wedges coming forward. If you have 5 regions that are bonded and one that's unshared pair, we call that square pyramidal. The lone pair, it doesn't really matter where the lone pair goes in this case. They're any of the 6 locations. But then if you have 4 bonding regions and 2 unshared pairs, you do have to be careful because the 2 lone pairs have to be opposite each other. They don't want to be right next to each other. They're going to be, again, as far apart from each other as possible. So you'll have the square planar shape. So we could just look at a few more examples. Carbon, and this is a really common mistake too. Don't count unshared pairs that aren't specifically on the center atom. So in this molecule, the carbon is in the center and it only has 2 double bonds attached to it. The unshared pairs are shown on the oxygen, but they have their own geometry, which is not really important since they're not a center atom. So you're just looking at the carbon, which is the center, and it has 2 bonds, 2 regions, because a multiple bond counts as 1 region. So that carbon has 2 regions, and we know that 2 regions is linear, even though they're double bonds. And so according to the VSEPR theory, this would be a linear molecule, and the bond angle is 180 degrees. This one, if you again look only at the center atom has 3 bonds. And that's all it has attached to it. So it has 3 regions because the double bond and each single bond counts as 1 region. So that's trigonal planar arrangement. And because there's all 3 things are bonded, then it's a trigonal planar geometry. Trigonal planar. And this one's easy to draw because it is just you can draw it all in one plane in 2 dimensions like this. Make sure that you make it look like a triangle though, because it is a triangle. And the bond angles are 120 degrees. Okay, so actually this ozone, O3, again, if you count just what's attached to the center O, there's a double bond, a single bond, and an unshared pair. So that counts as 3 regions. So 3 regions is trigonal planar arrangement. But since it only has 2 bonding regions and 1 unshared pair, we call that bent. So trigonal planar arrangement. Since one of the groups is a lone pair, it's bent or angular. And that's why it's drawn like this, because the unshared pair takes up the third space in the triangle. So we've got this bent shape. Note that the electron pair arrangement includes the lone pairs, but the molecular geometry refers just to the arrangement of the atoms. So that's why we have 2 different, we have the overall electron pair arrangement and then the molecular geometry. Okay, now here, these are all 3 examples of molecules that have 4 electron pair, so the overall tetrahedral arrangement. So the carbon, of course, has 4 bonds. The nitrogen has 3 bonds and 1 unshared pair, and the oxygen has 2 bonds and 2 unshared pair, but they still all have the overall tetrahedral arrangement. And so, but now the carbon will be, so the carbon the CCl4 has the tetrahedral shape because all 4 things are bonded. The NH is still overall tetrahedral, but it's trigonal planar because the actual molecule looks like a pyramid with a triangle base. And then the water, because it has the 2 unshared pairs taking up space. So they're all the tetrahedral arrangement, but 3 different shapes. And again, those unshared pairs are most important. Okay, if we have 5 electron pair regions, we have the trigonal bipyramidal arrangement. So that's what this is, PF5. Trigonal bipyramidal. Again, both 120 degree and 90 degree angle. These are also examples of the trigonal planar. And again, you have to be really careful. Like if you were just to look at this molecule, SF4, you might say, well, that's tetrahedral because there's 4 things. But you have to do the Lewis dot structure first. So if you do the Lewis dot structure, you'll see that SF4 actually has 5 regions. Okay, so it had each F has 7 electrons, valence electrons, so that's 28, plus another 6 is 34. So because there's 34 electrons, that extra pair goes on the sulfur. So this is actually the seesaw shape. ClF3 has 2 unshared pairs on the center, so it's T-shaped. And then XeF2 is linear, which you might have guessed anyway, but it's not. It's not just the 2 things attached. It's got 5 regions attached. It just happens that 3 of them are unshared pairs. All right, and then when we have our 6 electron pairs, we have the octahedron arrangement, and if all 6 are bonded, we have an octahedron. 90-degree angles. And then of course, again, don't just guess when you look at it. You have to draw the Lewis dot structure. IF5 actually has 5 bonded Fs and then has 1 unshared pair, so it's actually square pyramid. And then XeF4 is square planar because it has 2 unshared pairs.